Got it. Here's your content exactly as provided. Number 15. The modest Queen Victoria. You picture Queen Victoria, right? Dressed in perpetual black, stern-faced, the very embodiment of Victorian prudishness and staid moral rectitude. She's the grand old dame who supposedly ushered in an era so repressed, people covered piano legs to avoid scandal. You can practically hear the collective sigh of a nation stifled by corsets and a crippling fear of ankles. But here's the kicker. The historical equivalent of finding out your strict grandma was a secret rock star. This image of an eternally humorless, overly conservative monarch? It's largely a carefully constructed myth, largely based on her later years of mourning and a full-blown PR campaign to clean up the royal image. In her youth, Victoria was vivacious, enjoyed parties, drew caricatures of her stuffy courtiers. Imagine the shade. And had a rather robust sense of humor. Her courtship with Albert was intensely passionate, bordering on obsessive. We're talking full-blown, teenage-level infatuation, not some polite arranged marriage hand-holding. She chronicled her wedding night in her diary with astonishingly candid, even racy details. For a monarch of that era, it was shockingly un-Victorian. She wrote about her dearest Albert having large whiskers and how they kissed again and again. This wasn't some stoic, duty-bound arrangement. It was a fiery romance that would make a Regency novel blush. The stern, black-clad figure only truly emerged after Albert's death, when her grief became a public spectacle and a deliberate political tool. Basically, the woman who gave an entire era its name for prudishness was, in her younger days, probably more fun at a party than you were last weekend. Number 14. Genghis Khan, architect of tolerance. You've seen the movies, read the history books. Genghis Khan, the ultimate barbarian, the horse-riding, city-raising, skull-pyramid-building terror of the 13th century. He built an empire through brutal conquest, leaving a trail of destruction from Asia to Europe, responsible for the deaths of millions. Your history teacher probably used him as the prime example of guy you don't want showing up at your gate. And yes, much of that is true. His name still makes small children shiver in their sleep. But here's the mind-bending twist, the historical plot twist that makes you question everything. This mass murderer was also, arguably, one of history's most progressive leaders when it came to religious freedom. While he demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty to himself, and let's be real, you'd probably give it to him if he was at your door with a horse and a very large sword, he had a surprisingly enlightened policy on religion. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Taoists, animists, all were permitted to practice their faith freely within his vast Mongol empire, completely exempt from taxes and public service. He actively encouraged dialogue between different religious leaders and even forbade discrimination. Why? Was it a sudden burst of humanitarianism from the guy who just razed your city to the ground? Nah, not exactly. It was pure, unadulterated pragmatism. A stable empire needed loyal subjects, and religious persecution, as it turns out, is a fantastic way to breed dissent and annoying rebellions. He understood that a diverse population would be easier to govern if they weren't fighting each other over whose imaginary friend was superior. So, the guy who could wipe out entire populations with a single brutal command also created a blueprint for multi-faith coexistence. Basically, he was the guy who'd burn your village down, then offer you a tax exemption to rebuild if you just promised to pray quietly and didn't cause any trouble. Got it? Here's your content exactly as provided. Number 13. Marie Antoinette's missing cake quote. You know the one. The infamous line that supposedly sealed her fate, the perfect encapsulation of aristocratic detachment. Let them eat cake. It's printed in textbooks, parodied in pop culture, whispered in hushed tones by revolutionaries, and cemented Marie Antoinette's image as a clueless, extravagant queen utterly out of touch with her starving populace. You can almost see her shrugging delicately, adorned in pearls, completely oblivious to the bread riots outside her gilded palace. The problem? She almost certainly never said it. This quote, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche," let them eat brioche cake, actually predates her arrival in France and was attributed to various princesses long before the Revolution. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher whose ideas probably made Marie Antoinette's head spin, even mentioned a similar line in his Confessions, written before Marie Antoinette was even queen, attributing it to a great princess. Historians widely agree that by the time it became associated with her, it was likely a piece of revolutionary propaganda designed with surgical precision to inflame public opinion against the monarchy. It was the original viral smear campaign. Marie Antoinette, while undeniably extravagant, her fashion choices alone were enough to cause a national debt, was more preoccupied with her absurdly elaborate hairdos and her little hamlet at Versailles than with mocking the poor. The real tragedy is that this single apocryphal quote became the defining characteristic of a queen whose true downfall was a complex mix of political incompetence, foreignness, and a failing monarchy, not a flippant remark about baked goods. Basically, she got roasted by history for a quote that was, well, entirely baked. Number 12. Einstein's failed childhood. You probably imagine Albert Einstein, the genius, as a child prodigy, effortlessly solving complex equations while other kids struggled with their ABCs. The kind of kid whose kindergarten report card probably read, future Nobel laureate already questioning the fabric of space-time, possibly building a small, functional black hole under his desk. You envision him as perpetually brilliant, a tiny brainiac from birth. But here's the wonderfully human truth, the kind of truth that makes you feel a little better about your own awkward childhood photos. Young Albert was, by many conventional measures, a rather slow starter. He didn't speak fluently until he was around 3 years old, causing his parents considerable worry. Imagine being his mom, frantically wondering if he'd ever say anything beyond goo goo gaga, with a thoughtful frown. His teachers often found him slow and dreamy, and one famously told him he would never amount to anything. Bet that teacher felt like a real intellectual giant later on, huh? He struggled in school, not because he lacked intelligence, obviously, but because he disliked rote memorization and the rigid authoritarian teaching methods of the time. He rebelled against the system, preferring to learn at his own pace, driven by insatiable curiosity rather than external pressure. He even failed his first attempt at the entrance exam for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich, particularly struggling with non-science subjects. So the man who revolutionized physics was once a kid who couldn't string a sentence together for a while and failed a test. Basically, your awkward elementary school photo is probably way closer to Einstein's reality than any genius baby montage you've seen in a documentary. Number 11. Gandhi, not always the saint. You've got the image. Mahatma Gandhi, the benevolent, peaceful, loincloth-clad saint who led India to independence through nonviolent resistance. He's the embodiment of moral purity, self-sacrifice, and universal love. You see him on countless posters, inspiring generations to be better humans, to turn the other cheek, to maybe try that whole civil disobedience thing. He's basically human perfection, right? But peel back the layers, and you'll find a more complex, at times deeply flawed individual. While his commitment to nonviolence was unwavering and his impact on history undeniable, his personal life and some of his early views were complicated. For instance, and prepare for your jaw to hit the floor, his early opinions on black Africans were shockingly derogatory. During his time in South Africa, he often referred to black people as Kafirs, a deeply offensive racial slur, and advocated for the rights of Indians as distinct from, and often superior to, Africans. He believed Indians were infinitely superior to the Kafirs, and sometimes expressed disgust at what he perceived as their uncivilized habits. This isn't some tiny footnote. These were foundational, deeply uncomfortable views that directly contradict his later image. And if that wasn't enough to make you do a double take, he also experimented with extreme asceticism, including bizarre dietary regimens and, controversially, sharing his bed with young naked women, including his grandniece, as a spiritual experiment in celibacy, which understandably caused immense discomfort and concern among his followers. This isn't to diminish his monumental achievements in civil rights and his revolutionary approach to political resistance, but it's a vital, if uncomfortable, reminder that even our greatest heroes are complex human beings, capable of deeply uncomfortable contradictions. Basically, the spiritual guru you admire had some early views that would make your jaw drop faster than a dropped spinning wheel. Number 10. Abraham Lincoln. The Great Depressive. You think of Abraham Lincoln as the resolute, stoic leader who who held a fracturing nation together through its darkest hour, delivering eloquent speeches and exuding unshakable determination. He's the strong, steady hand guiding the Union through the Civil War, the guy whose face is literally carved into a mountain. You imagine him as perpetually composed, a rock in a storm. While his political resolve was indeed legendary, what many overlook is the profound and lifelong battle he waged with severe clinical depression, or melancholy, as it was then called. Lincoln wrestled with deep despair, bouts of suicidal ideation, and incapacitating periods of sadness throughout his adult life. Friends and colleagues frequently described him as the most unfortunate man they had ever known, prone to fits of deep gloom that would render him unresponsive. Imagine trying to run a country when you can barely get out of bed, battling your own mind every single day. He often used humor as a coping mechanism, a way to deflect from the darkness within, telling jokes to lighten the mood, even as he carried an immense internal burden. It's theorized that his struggles with depression actually contributed to his incredible empathy and his ability to understand human suffering, making him a more effective leader during a time of immense national tragedy. Far from being a perfectly composed figure, Lincoln was a man who knew profound internal struggle, battling his own mind even as he battled for the soul of a nation. This wasn't just a bad mood day, this was a fundamental part of who he was. Basically, the guy on the $5 bill was often feeling about $5 short of happy. Got it. Here's your content exactly as provided. Number 9. Napoleon Bonaparte, the short story. You've got the image ingrained. Napoleon, the diminutive, angry Frenchman, famously compensating for his height with a massive ego and even larger conquests. The little corporal is practically synonymous with being short, power-hungry, and having a perpetual chip on his shoulder. You can almost see him stomping around demanding a taller horse. But here's the inconvenient truth about this widespread perception, the reality check that deflates the myth faster than a poorly made souffle. Napoleon wasn't actually short for his time. At around 5 feet 6 inches, 1.68 meters, or 5 feet 7 inches, 1.70 meters, he was in fact slightly taller than the average Frenchman of the late 18th century. The average height for men in France back then was closer to 5 feet 4 inches. So, where did this pervasive myth come from? It's largely attributed to British propaganda during the Napoleonic Wars, which deliberately portrayed him as comically small to undermine his formidable image. Caricaturists like James Gilray mercilessly depicted him as a tiny, furious tyrant, shrinking him on paper to diminish his stature in the public eye. Furthermore, the French Imperial Guard who often surrounded him were exceptionally tall, elite soldiers, making him appear shorter by comparison. It's the visual equivalent of standing next to a basketball team. Suddenly, you feel like a hobbit. So while he was certainly a towering figure in history, it wasn't his literal height that was remarkable, but the colossal misconception about it. Basically, he was average, but a very effective smear campaign made him seem like he needed a booster seat for his throne. Number 8. Cleopatra. Not quite the Egyptian queen. You think of Cleopatra and an image of a seductive, exotic Egyptian queen, probably with flowing dark hair and olive skin, lounging dramatically on a velvet couch, immediately springs to mind. She's the last pharaoh, the iconic ruler of the Nile, practically dripping with ancient mystique. You've seen the movies, you know the drill. But here's the archaeological mic drop, the historical bombshell that shatters your carefully constructed image. Cleopatra wasn't ethnically Egyptian. She was, in fact, a direct descendant of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals, who established the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. This means she was Macedonian Greek. Imagine that. The most famous Egyptian queen was about as Egyptian as a feta cheese sandwich. While she was the first in her family line to actually learn Egyptian and embrace some Egyptian customs, a rather clever political move, mind you. Considering she was ruling Egypt, her heritage was decidedly Hellenistic. Coins from her reign depict her with a prominent nose and strong features, not necessarily the classic Hollywood beauty often portrayed. So her allure wasn't just about physical beauty, it was about her sharp intellect, her undeniable charisma, and her strategic brilliance. She commanded respect from Roman leaders like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, through her political prowess and her impressive ability to speak multiple languages, not just her looks. She could outwit you in 5 different dialects. Basically, the most famous Egyptian queen was about as Egyptian as, well, anyone who moves to a new country and adapts to the local culture, but far more politically astute and, let's be honest, probably way more intimidating. Number 7. Christopher Columbus, not a flat earther fighter. You've heard the heroic tale. Christopher Columbus, the brave visionary, defied the ignorant, flat earth-believing establishment of his time by proving the world was round. He was sailing against the tide of medieval superstition, a lone beacon of scientific truth in a sea of geographical illiteracy. You probably pictured him bravely pointing at the horizon, while everyone else nervously clutched the edges of their flat maps. Except, that's not quite how it went down. The educated people of Columbus's era, including the scholars and navigators, already knew the Earth was round. This knowledge had been commonplace since ancient Greek times. Nobody with a functioning brain thought the world was a giant pancake. What Columbus was actually debating with the scholars and monarchs was the size of the Earth, and consequently the feasibility of reaching Asia by sailing west. He drastically underestimated the Earth's circumference, believing it to be much smaller than it actually was. The experts he consulted, correctly as it turns out, argued that his proposed journey was far too long for his ships and crew to survive without resupplying. They weren't worried about him falling off the edge of the world. They were worried about him starving in the vast open ocean somewhere between Spain and, well, not China. His bravery was less about challenging a flat earth dogma and more about a stubborn, almost miraculous miscalculation that just happened to bump into an entire continent nobody in Europe knew about. Basically, he wasn't proving the world was round. He was just really, really bad at math and accidentally discovered America because of it. Sometimes history is just a glorious accident. Number 6. George Washington's wooden teeth. You've probably heard the myth. It's practically carved into the Mount Rushmore of American folklore. George Washington, America's first president, suffered from terrible dental problems and wore a set of clunky, painful wooden teeth. It's a widely accepted fact that adds a touch of relatable, rustic charm to the otherwise majestic figure. You can almost hear the creak of timber every time he opened his mouth to deliver a profound presidential address. Well, prepare to have your historical dental work corrected, because this one is getting pulled. George Washington never had wooden teeth. While he did endure excruciating dental issues throughout his adult life, losing most of his teeth by the time he became president. Imagine trying to run a country with that kind of toothache. His dentures were actually far more sophisticated and terrifying than simple wood. His various sets of false teeth were crafted from a horrifying array of materials, including ivory from hippopotamus or elephant, because apparently even presidents had exotic dental needs, human teeth, often purchased from enslaved people, which is a whole other level of dark history, lead, gold, and brass screws. Wood would have swollen and warped in his mouth, making them utterly unusable. Imagine trying to chew a steak with swollen oak in your mouth. The wooden appearance likely came from the ivory staining over time due to his notorious love of port wine, which probably turned them a delightful shade of dark brown. So, while the visual of a president gnawing on oak is appealing in its quaintness, the reality was a grotesque mashup of animal and human parts held together with metal. Basically, his dentures were a Frankenstein's monster of dentistry, making the idea of wooden teeth sound almost pleasant by comparison. You'll never look at a $5 bill the same way again. Number 5. Pocahontas, the Disney-fied princess. You know the story. Pocahontas, the brave, beautiful Native American princess who saved Captain John Smith, fell in love and helped bridge the gap between her people and the English settlers. It's a tale of romance, daring, and cultural harmony, set to a soundtrack of soaring orchestral music and possibly involving talking animals. You picture her with long, flowing hair, running through forests, a true heroine. But the historical truth is far less romantic and considerably more complex, reflecting a darker side of colonial encounter. For starters, she was likely a child, perhaps around 10 to 12 years old, when she supposedly saved John Smith. So that epic love story with a full-grown man? Yeah, not so much. Their relationship was certainly not a romance as depicted. At best, it was a complicated interaction between a powerful adult and a preteen girl from a completely different culture. The saving incident itself is highly disputed, with many historians believing it was a ritualistic adoption ceremony rather than a literal last-minute rescue, or perhaps even a complete fabrication by Smith to embellish his narrative and make himself look more heroic. Her subsequent capture by the English, forced conversion to Christianity, and marriage to John Rolfe, not Smith, by the way, poor John Smith got completely written out of that sequel, were primarily political acts designed to secure peace between the powerful Powhatan Confederacy and the ever-encroaching English colonists. She traveled to England, presented as a civilized convert, and tragically died there at a young age from disease. Basically, Disney traded historical accuracy for a good song and a talking raccoon, turning a complex, tragic figure into a fairy tale princess, proving that sometimes the truth is just too messy for a sing-along. Got it. Here's your content exactly as provided. Number 4. Isaac Newton and the Apple Mohan. You picture it, right? Isaac Newton, sitting thoughtfully under an apple tree, minding his own business, perhaps contemplating the existential dread of laundry day, when thwack! An apple falls directly on his head, and in that instant he has a eureka moment, suddenly comprehending the universal law of gravity. It's the perfect, simple origin story for one of history's greatest scientific breakthroughs. You can almost hear the cartoon ding as the light bulb goes off over his head. But while the anecdote might be charming, and certainly memorable, it's almost certainly an embellished story, not a literal event. Newton himself, in his later years, told the story to several acquaintances, including his biographer William Stukeley. However, it was more likely a moment of observation and contemplation, not a direct cranial impact. He observed apples falling from trees, and presumably other objects also falling to the ground. And this general observation, combined with years of deep intellectual work, because that's what true genius looks like, lots of head-scratching, not head trauma, led him to ponder the invisible force that pulled objects to Earth, eventually formulating his theory. It was a gradual process of rigorous scientific inquiry, not a sudden, fruit-induced enlightenment. The apple probably served as a simple, relatable metaphor he used to explain a complex idea to others, because gravity is the mutual attraction of masses, isn't quite as catchy as an apple hit me on the head. Basically, gravity existed before Newton's head became an accidental target, and his genius was less about head trauma and more about, being a genius who put in the work. Number 3. Vincent van Gogh, the ear-cutting lone wolf. You know the tragic image, Vincent van Gogh, the tortured artist, a solitary genius driven to madness, who famously sliced off his own ear in a fit of despair, painting his most intense works in isolation, misunderstood by the world. He's the poster child for the suffering artist, the brilliant recluse whose inner turmoil fueled his vibrant canvases. You imagine him in a desolate field, alone with his easel and his demons. But while he certainly struggled with profound mental illness and the ear incident absolutely did happen, the lone wolf aspect of his creative life is a massive misconception. Van Gogh wasn't some isolated hermit. He was deeply engaged with the art world and desperately sought connection. His famous move to Arles was precisely to found an artists' colony, a studio of the South, where artists could live and work together, collaborating and sharing ideas. He constantly corresponded with his beloved brother Theo and other artists, sharing ideas, seeking validation, and even asking for art supplies. The ear incident itself, while a clear and devastating sign of his deteriorating mental state, was not an act performed in complete isolation. It happened after a severe argument with his friend and fellow artist Paul Gauguin, who had come to live with him in Arles, leading to the dramatic rupture of their strained relationship. Van Gogh's madness was often exacerbated by his intense personal relationships and his struggles to find his place within a community, not just from solitary despair. Basically, his ear incident was less about a solo descent into madness and more about a really, really bad roommate dispute that escalated dramatically, proving that sometimes even artistic genius can't solve interpersonal problems. Number 2. Benjamin Franklin, The kite-flying inventor. You picture it. Benjamin Franklin, the wise old statesman, with his spectacles perched on his nose, standing valiantly in a thunderstorm, flying a kite with a key tied to its string, a dramatic flash of lightning striking the key, proving once and for all that lightning is electricity. It's an iconic image of American ingenuity, a bold scientific experiment, and a testament to fearless curiosity. You can almost feel the static electricity crackling in the air as he makes his groundbreaking discovery. And yes, Franklin was undoubtedly a brilliant scientist and inventor, but the famous kite experiment, as popularly depicted, likely never happened exactly that way, or at least not in the dramatic, direct lightning strike fashion. Franklin himself was highly cautious and intelligent. He wouldn't have risked electrocution by standing directly in a lightning storm holding a metal key connected to a live wire. That's just asking for a very literal zap to the afterlife. His own accounts of the experiment suggest a much more controlled, careful process, possibly using a kite to draw static electricity from storm clouds rather than a direct, bone-shattering lightning strike. The goal was to prove that lightning was electricity, a revolutionary idea at the time, not to capture a bolt directly and become a human lightning rod. Other scientists who tried to replicate the mythical version of the experiment, thinking they could just catch a lightning bolt, often died. The romanticized version of the story likely gained traction due to early biographers embellishing the tale to make it more dramatic and accessible for the masses. Basically, Franklin was a genius, but he wasn't quite foolish enough to use himself as a human lightning rod for science, and his legendary experiment was more about subtle observation than a shocking spectacle. Number 1. The Vikings. Not just horned helmet savages. You know the drill. Fierce, brutish Vikings with their iconic horned helmets pillaging monasteries, sailing dragon-headed longships, and generally being the scariest raiders medieval Europe had ever seen. They were pure barbarians, right? You probably imagine them roaring, swinging axes, and looking utterly terrifying in those magnificent, if slightly impractical helmets. Well, yes, they were certainly fearsome warriors and raiders, capable of utterly ruining your Tuesday, but the image of them as just savage pillagers is a vast oversimplification, and that horned helmet? Pure fantasy. There is absolutely no archaeological evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets into battle. They would have been incredibly impractical and dangerous in combat, just begging to get caught on something or used as a handle by your enemy. The myth likely originated from 19th century Romantic nationalism, particularly in theatrical costumes and illustrations designed to make them look more dramatic and, frankly, a bit more cartoonish. In reality, the Vikings were also incredibly sophisticated traders, explorers, settlers, and skilled craftsmen. They established vast trade networks stretching from North America to the Middle East, founded major cities like Dublin and Kiev, pioneered advanced shipbuilding and navigation techniques that put others to shame, and had complex legal systems and rich poetic traditions. They were integral to the development of many European societies, not just their destruction. They were global entrepreneurs with a penchant for occasional, highly effective, and deeply inconvenient raiding. Basically, they were far more than just horned-helmeted thugs. They were a globalized entrepreneurial force who just happened to be really good at raiding on the side. You might have been more likely to find a Viking negotiating a trade deal than chopping off a head, though. Of course, they were perfectly capable of doing both.